It's now 1:05. Welcome to the Fireside Chat, which is going to be a conversation about environmental justice and healthcare equity. Today's panel is presented by Howard's Energy and Environmental Law Society and GW's Environmental Energy Law Association. My name is Priya Patel. I'm a second-year law student at the George Washington University School of Law, and I serve on the executive board for GW's ELA as our environmental outreach coordinator. Welcome to our nation's capital. I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge that Washington, D.C. sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostan Native American community. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be hearing about how environmental racism impacts health equity and what the legal community can do to dismantle systemic injustices. Today's conversation will discuss environmental racism, racial capitalism, healthcare equity, and reparations. Our moderator today will be Ellis Walton. Ellis is a second-year student at the Howard University School of Law, and he serves as the outreach coordinator on the executive board of Howard's Energy and Environmental Law Society. Thank you, Ellis, for moderating today. I now turn it over to you to begin today's programming.
Thank you, Priya. As Priya stated, I'm Ellis Walton. I serve as an environmental justice fellow at the Howard University School of Law Environmental Justice Center, as well as serving as the Director of Community Service for the Howard Energy and Environmental Law Society. And we are just thankful for you all to come today and to hear these great conversations about issues affecting Black, Indigenous, and poor communities across America. And we also invite you to our breakout sessions at 2 p.m. after the event to just discuss the various issues and to have a more personal, close talk and conversation about these issues. And now I'll pass it to Dodson, President of HEALS.
Thanks, Ellis, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nasia Dodson. I'm president of Howard's Energy and Environmental Law Society, and I have the incredible honor of introducing one of our panelists, Professor Carlton Waterhouse, today. Professor Waterhouse is a graduate of Pennsylvania State University, where he studied engineering and the ethics of technology. He is also a graduate of the Howard University School of Law. While at Hess, Professor Waterhouse served as an intern with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law, and he worked on formulating and developing the Civil Rights Act of 1992, which is a mic drop in and of itself. But he's done far more work since then, so I'll keep going. After completing law school, Professor Waterhouse worked with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where he served in the Office of Regional Counsel in Atlanta, Georgia, and the Office of General Counsel in Washington, D.C. And at the EPA, Professor Waterhouse served as chief counsel in several significant cases, which is an incredibly modest way of saying that Professor Waterhouse worked on landmark research, including Flint, Michigan, and also one of the only cases where the EPA has ever found discrimination, which is historic, but I'll let him explain that a little bit further in the panel if we get to it. Also, his responsibilities at the EPA included enforcement actions under environmental statutes, the development of regional and national policy on environmental justice, and the application of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to EPA permitting actions. Professor Carlton Waterhouse is an international expert on environmental law and environmental justice, as well as reparations and redress for historic injustices. He's testified on the importance of reparations for African Americans before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He is a Fulbright research scholar, a board member of the Environmental Law Institute. He's our professor of property, leg-reg, environmental law, the Environmental Justice Center, and soon to be our professor of international climate change law. So please join me in welcoming the highly accredited, very impressive Professor Carlton Waterhouse.
Thank you so much, Nasia. Can you go with me everywhere?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Waterhouse, for sharing your time with us today. My name is Austin Himes. I'm a second-year student at GW Law, and I serve as president of the GW Environmental and Energy Law Association. Again, to our virtual attendees across America, welcome. Thank you for coming. Our student association would also like to thank GW Law and Howard Law for their support of this event. So it is now my honor to introduce today's panelists from GW, the Dean of George Washington University Law School, Dr. Dayna Bowen Matthew. So she is a nationally recognized lawyer and legal scholar with 3 decades of industry and academic experience. Dean Matthew is the first woman to lead GW Law. So Dean Matthew received a BA in economics from Harvard Radcliffe College, a JD from the UVA School of Law, and a PhD in health and behavioral sciences from the University of Colorado, Denver. She is an expert in health equity and public health policy and has held many important policy positions as a result. Of note, she served as senior advisor in the Office of Civil Rights at the EPA and is currently a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in their Center for Health Policy. So while teaching at the UVA Law School, she served as the Matheson and Morgenthau Distinguished Professor of Law and also as the Weber Research Professor for Civil Liberties and Human Rights. Dean Bowen Matthew also taught at the UVA School of Medicine as a professor of public health sciences and also served as a director of the very important Equity Center at UVA, which works to build relationships between the university and Charlottesville to address racial and socioeconomic equality. Before that, she also taught at the University of Kentucky Law School and was Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at the University of Colorado Law School. So finally, she's the author of the book Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare, has co-authored dozens of book chapters and articles, again, focusing largely on healthcare reform, public health law, patient protection, and civil rights. So we are thrilled to have her as our new dean. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dayna Bowen Matthew. I'll turn it over to Ellis Walton to get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you, Austin, for that wonderful introduction. Same to you, Nasia. And so this first question is going to be for you, Dr. Waterhouse. We just learned a little bit about your role as an international expert on environmental law, environmental justice, as well as reparations. Could you tell us how you came to develop these skills as well as expertise?
So first, thanks so much to the GW Energy and Environmental Law Association, as well as HEALS for this opportunity and for this invitation, for the chance to be on this webinar with such an esteemed and established and renowned and accomplished scholar such as Dr. Dean Bowen Matthew. It's an honor. So I came to this work in a very interesting way. While I was a student at Howard Law School, I actually went to a session that was about environmental justice. And I had never really heard of environmental justice. I didn't know what environmental justice was. I just kind of happened upon this panel. And when I went in and I listened to the panel and they explained that there was such a thing as racism carried out in the environmental context, I was taken aback. And so it really sparked my interest, having looked while I was in college at the ethics of technology. And so I wanted to learn more. And that led me to getting involved in an externship at the Environmental Protection Agency while I was a student at Howard, and then beginning to explore more about whether or not there was, what this concern about environmental racism was about. And then I've never really looked back. So it caught my interest early on, and I understood at that time that it was a central issue in protecting the well-being and health of all people, all communities, but particularly for communities of color and low-income communities more broadly. And that's kept me working to learn more and to get more and more involved to try to make a difference.
Thank you, Professor Waterhouse. And now for you, Dean Bowen Matthew. We learned about your role as well as a leader in public health and civil rights law. So could you talk to us about how you came into that specialty?
Sure, but I also first want to say thank you. You're going to hear that DC is all around us. So right now you hear DC's signature sound, I think, which is police cars. There's something real special about this town. It's over-policed in a way I've never seen, and I grew up in the South Bronx. But that is how I came to the work. And how I have the privilege of being on a panel with Dr. Waterhouse. I really appreciate the honor of being with such an esteemed scholar, but also more than that, a scholar, a person who is actually taking that scholarship into the real world and making a difference. I also want to thank the alliance between GW and Howard. Being in DC, where law is made and where law is changed, will only happen as students from each of our schools come together to do this kind of important work. And I am thrilled to see that both GW and Howard students are working together to make this thing I'm going to call structural racism. I'm going to call it right out because I'm going to be talking about it the whole time. Make this structural racism go away. So I come to the work because I grew up in the South Bronx, and my parents were wise enough to bus me 90 minutes away to go to school in Riverdale. That means I traveled between two completely different worlds every day, and I saw the injustice of those two worlds every day. So in a 90-minute bus ride, I could see the difference between the densely populated housing that I and my friends lived in, the garbage-strewn streets that I walked over in order to get to the subway. There was a stop on my subway line where all of the Black people and brown people got off, all of the white people and the white people got on. And when we got there, the houses were lovely, sprawling, grassy knolls, parks, places to run, places to exercise, plentiful food sources, no pollution sources, no highways ran through there. And the reason I was there was because the schools were excellent there, as in contrast to my schools. So there was something fundamentally and structurally wrong with the difference between these two worlds. And it was not lost on me, even as a fourth grader and going forward, that one world was Black and brown and one world was white. That fundamentally sealed my need to find a way to understand why and then contribute to the changes of these two different worlds. It wasn't until later that I discovered that these two worlds were not only just different in appearance, but the place matters moniker of public health meant that these two different worlds were different from a standpoint of who lived and who died, right? The people got sicker and died quicker in the world I came from as compared to the world I went to school in. And that was more than unfair, that was untenable. When I finally figured out that place matters is connected to that quicker and sicker and deadliness of life, I began to expand that in a public health context to see that it wasn't just housing and food sources and recreation, but it was very much also about environmental racism. And so those structural issues I lived since fourth grade, and only as I grew in my education and in my exposure did I realize that the environment played such a huge, overwhelming part in that disparity.
Thank you, Dayna Matthew. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get us to dive into the issues. So the second question is really, how do you all define environmental racism, and how do you all define health equity? And could you contrast the two?
I'll defer to the dean.
Okay, I was actually going to defer to you. I'm going to start with health equity first, because health is like the canary in the coal mine. That is to say that health is a way to measure the level of inequality in a society, and I dare say the level of racism in a society. So health equity means being able to declare that a society gives every member of that population the equal opportunity to be healthy, an equal opportunity to be healthy. I neglected to say in my earlier remarks that I come to this as a lawyer, and equal opportunity, equal justice seems to be the undergirding and overarching theme of our nation, right? And so an equal opportunity to be healthy seems like, if not a human right, which I believe it is, certainly a constitutional right in the United States. But we can tell by the health outcomes that this is not true, right? So health equity does not exist in the United States. Everyone does not have an equal opportunity to be healthy. Why? Because they don't have an equal opportunity to enjoy all of the social determinants of health. I don't see an equal opportunity for Black and brown people to enjoy decent, clean housing, right? That is safe and keeps people healthy and free from asthma and lung disease and structural defects. I don't see an equal opportunity to have equal access to healthy food. I don't see an equal opportunity as the United Church of Christ report first documented in 1987, I don't see an equal opportunity to live free from pollution. That is how I come to environmental racism. Environmental racism is the disproportionate burden that people of color bear in being exposed to unhealthy pollution.
Wow, that's amazing. There's not a lot I could add to that. It was very well said. The one thing I would add in terms of thinking about environmental racism and environmental injustice is that there are different axes upon which I think this injustice happens. One of them is the distributional axis, which the dean has just talked to us about, right? How well the goods of the society, right, are distributed, and how well the bads of the society are distributed, right? So pollution is a bad of the society and it gets distributed, right? And then there are goods of the society like access to clean air, access to clean water, access to healthy housing, to clean housing, access to green spaces and parks and waterways, right? Clean waterways. So those are goods and they get distributed inequitably and they get distributed based on race. And so that's part of what environmental injustice is. But also environmental racism and environmental injustice is also a reflection of the way that processes and decisions are being made in society, right? So part of the environmental injustice is the fact that people who are bearing the burdens also don't have an equal opportunity to be involved in the decision making, right? So they're not involved in the decision making, nor are they able to get equal regard, right? So their racial identity in many ways causes them to get less regard in a political context by the people who are making decisions than people in other communities, right? So that also is its own injustice. And then lastly, I'll talk about the fact that the benefits of these facilities that produce the pollution are not equitably distributed. So I might bear the burden of having the pollution sources in the ground, in the water, in the air, in my community, but I don't get the benefits of the high salary of those working in the plants. I don't get the benefits of the stock ownership of those owning the plants. I don't get the benefit of the CEOs and C-suite members running the companies, right? And so we see an inequity involved in how the harms are distributed, how the benefits are distributed, how the decisions are being made, and then the level of regard that communities get, right? It's very clear that all communities don't get the same level of regard, right? And race is a determining factor in the political process and in the economic process too often about how much regard, which communities are we going to stay away from? Which communities would it be ludicrous to even suggest that we might think about the idea of putting a facility anywhere near to it, right? Because we know that if we were to even try it, we might lose our jobs or lose our position in office, right? And so there is not a sense of equity or equality in the way environmental decisions are made. And that kind of is how I would supplement to what the dean has already mentioned.
Thank you, Professor. And so we talked about how one aspect of environmental racism is distributing harms disproportionately to people of color and poor communities. And so could you all talk about the nexus between this between environmental racism and these burdens put on colors of community, and just the nexus between that as in the COVID pandemic?
So I will start and then defer to Professor Waterhouse. Let me say that in building off of what Professor Waterhouse has said, let me be crystal clear about the fact that this distribution, the inequity of processes that Professor Waterhouse is talking about is no accident, right? These are by design and they're by legal design. That's why I'm so happy to be on a program where law students are talking about environmental injustice and environmental racism, because lest there be any confusion whatsoever, I'm going to quote a title from an article that Vernice Darcel Miller Travis wrote. The system is not broken. The system is working exactly as it was organized to work by law, right? So I'm going to get to your COVID question because I want to connect it to the law. The data that we are looking at is no surprise. There's nothing surprising about the inequality and the inequity. We're seeing the disproportionate morbidity and mortality in COVID-19. None of this should surprise us. Why? Because we can look at structural racism as it was designed from before this country was founded, right? Before the country was founded, we had laws on the book in the 1600s to make sure that separate was not equal, that the social determinants of health, particularly housing is the one that really organizes all of the other social determinants of health, by law, were distributed inequitably so that the opportunity to live a healthy life was inequitably distributed, and the opportunity to take part in the processes that Professor Waterhouse is talking about are also inequitably distributed, right? My ability as an African-American woman to participate in and to vote in 2020, right, is disproportionately distributed by laws that close polling places, by laws that require brown people to bring IDs, right? So the law that said you have to live there and you have to live there, right? The law that said you go to school there and you go to school there is the same law that says you get to earn $8 of net worth as compared to $178 of net worth of that person over there. So then when we look at the COVID outcomes, right, we're at 214,000 people who have died. If you look at the distribution right now, and I'm just going to look at my data because I just checked it before I came on this program, right? If you go to the CDC, you'll see that the number of cases for Native American people is 2.8 times that for white people. The number of hospitalizations from COVID for Native American people is 5.3 times that of white people, right? Hospitalizations for Black and African American, I call those interchangeably Black, African American, Black. I refer to anybody who is of African descent. 4.7 times hospitalizations, 2.1 times death rate, right? For COVID-19 in 2020. Now, if that surprises anyone, you haven't been paying attention, right? You haven't been paying attention to the fact that the underlying comorbidities, we like to talk about the fact that you have to be predisposed to be sick. You don't get predisposition of disproportional diabetes, heart disease, stroke, etc. Those underlying comorbidities, they don't happen by accident. They happen by law, because my housing, my food, my recreation, my education, my employment, my income, and every other social determinant of health in the United States is disproportionately distributed so that the outcome, the health, the canary in the gold mine is a demonstration of that inequality. So that's the connection, right? If you create a society where all of the social determinants of health are structurally inequitable, right? I get the privilege of living near the bad pollution that white people don't get, right? I get the privilege of living on a reservation with no clean water, no fair housing, and no health care that white people, then you're going to get disproportionate outcomes in COVID-19.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and so well said. I would just add to that that there are existing disparities and exposures to pollution, but also increase people's vulnerability to COVID-19. So I'm going to go through a few statistics in case people are just not that familiar. And in fact, maybe if I could share my screen, I wasn't planning on doing that, but maybe, nope, that's not possible. So I'll just read a couple of notes about that, right? So one, African-American and Latinx community members are exposed at 2.7 times to nitrous dioxide, the rate of whites. And of course, NO2 is a cause of heart disease, asthma, and other lung diseases. NO2 disparities without COVID-19 lead to an additional 7,000 African-American and Latinx deaths each year. In the same way, when we think about asthma, right? Black children are twice as likely as their white counterparts to have asthma and have increased rates of asthma attack and deaths compared with their white counterparts. African Americans are more likely to live in counties with the worst ozone pollution, and as a result, suffer from increased suffer from increased health disparities, including lower birth weight, decreased lung function in newborns, and onset of asthma. Studies also indicate that increased short and long-term ozone exposure is a likely cause of early death, cardiovascular harm, such as heart attacks, strokes, and congestive heart failure. The mean residential nitrous dioxide concentrations in 2010 were about 7% higher for those in poverty than those who are above the poverty line. So we can see that class matters in terms of pollutant exposure, but it doesn't matter as much as race. The disparity in that NO2 exposure for non-whites is 37% higher than it is for whites, irrespective of income. Lastly, I'll talk about particulate matter, which the Harvard study on COVID-19 had directly linked to a higher rate of COVID vulnerability. For particulate matter, people in poverty had a 1.3 times higher burden than did the overall population. However, African Americans have a 1.5 times burden higher than the overall population, right? Disparities in the burdens from the particulate matter emitting facilities exist across different scales, but it's clear that disparities for Blacks are more pronounced than those are for persons who just happen to be low income. And so if we just want to talk about class or socioeconomics, it's not enough to resolve the problem, because it is not the problem. It is a part of the problem, but it's not the problem. Racial discrimination, historic and ongoing, is a critical, central aspect and cause of the disparities that we're talking about in the environment and then in turn in health. And if we don't attend to that structural racism that has led to this, we won't see inroads, right, in being able to work towards solutions.
Thank you, Professor Waterhouse. You have kind of segue us into our next question, which is about systemic racism, but systemic racism in our economic system as well as in our political system. And so this next question is, how has racial capitalism and white supremacy affected the ability of people of color to achieve environmental justice and health equity? And just for the audience's point of information, when we're talking about racial capitalism, we mean the economic system with a historical legacy of exploiting people of color for capital as well as profit gain.
Dean?
This is why I love being with students, and I miss being in the classroom. I have to confess, I had to go look up this term that you just defined for me. And boy, did it open a whole new world for me. Capital racism, is that how we say it?
Racial capitalism. You can say either way.
Racial capitalism. I love it. I absolutely love it. Let me just see if I can break some of it down. And since this is a fireside chat, some of the students are going to teach me a few things. First, I want to be very clear that when Professor Waterhouse is quoting those, what I consider to be tragic and damning statistics that connect race over socioeconomic status to death and disease due to pollution and its connection to COVID, let's be clear, this is not about race being the determinant or the predictor, right? This is about structural racism being the determinant and the predictor, right? So one of the things we have to make sure we don't do is biologize race, right? Just because we see a correlation between a people who have been socially constructed as a racial group and a deficit, right? Which are the data that Professor Waterhouse was so eloquently describing for us. That's not because of their race. That's because of the social construct that goes with that race, right? And one of those social constructs is the racist capitalism that I am learning about and that I want to turn my attention to now that Ellis asked us about. And for this, bear with me for a second, because now I have to connect some dots, right? So I said historically, before the foundation of the nation, we had laws in place that told people where they had to live. Once you tell people where they have to live, you tell them also what kind of work they're going to get, right? You tell them what kind of education they're going to get. You're going to tell them what kind of future they're going to be able to give their children. And you basically set their financial future in motion for generations to come, right? So if I am looking at the historical context, people want to know, we wish you all would stop talking about slavery. I would love to stop talking about slavery. I would love for slavery to be over. The problem is that slavery is still hurting me today from a financial and economic perspective. When that stops, I'm going to stop. But until then, I have to tell you that the fact that the nation, had a head start by using my labor for free until 1877-ish. And then immediately after that decided that you might not use it for free, but you certainly weren't going to educate me equally until about 1954, right? And after it was required by law that you educated me to give me the same financial prospects, massive resistance let me know how little you wanted me to sit next to you in school and how little you wanted me to be able to have the same economic opportunities as you, so that we end up today, and this is a data point that I was quoting elsewhere, with a net worth financially, because my educational opportunities generation after generation have been limited. We end up with a net worth where I as a people have $8 net worth. In the city of Boston, that's the example I'm quoting right now, as against white families that have an average net worth of $171,000, right? Now, that didn't happen because I was not diligent. That did not happen because I did not work hard in school. That happened because structurally, the system made sure that from slavery to Jim Crow to post-civil rights to today, right? If I could share my slides, I'd show you my home in the South Bronx, right? Today is a failed school zone, so that kids that go to preschool in my old neighborhood now are guaranteed to be below the poverty line 30 years from now. It's already the die is cast. That is economic racism. The structures that made sure that unless somebody, and there's probably one family, maybe two in my old neighborhood, like me, that were able to get up on a bus and go 90 minutes away in order to go to school and change my economic prospects. By the age of 16, most of these kids will not be participants in the economy of the United States of America. That is economic racism.
Thank you, Dean Matthew. And Professor Waterhouse, I want to kind of dive deeper into this topic. And so I want to bring up a article you wrote in 2017 about environmental justice. And in this article, you talk about racial and class dominance.
Can you lean in, Ellis?
Yes, sorry.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
It's better.
Okay, yeah, so in 2017, you wrote an article about environmental justice. And in this article, you talked about class and racial dominance, as well as the free market ideology. Could you just talk about those 3 points and just how they connect to environmental justice and systemic environmental justice?
Yeah, I will. I mean, there are a couple of things that are really important that I want to build on that the dean has also emphasized, right? So capitalism was really at the core of the way the society was established. And that approach to capitalism treated people differently based on their racial and group identities. As a result of that, there were financial benefits that were provided to people based on their racial group identities. It was advantageous to you not to be Mexican American in Nevada or New Mexico or Colorado or California or Arizona or Texas after the United States took those territories from Mexico. Why? Because white settlers in court, in business ventures, and in all aspects of the society at that time were favored. They were favored economically. They were favored politically. So they had land that they owned when they were citizens in Mexico that they were promised under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to be able to keep and maintain, that were then subsequently taken from them by white settlers through squatting, through courts disavowing the legitimacy of their title deeds, and through just a straight up decision to favor whites. That same idea of favoring whites in the legal system meant they were favored in the economic system. That was true with regards to Asian Americans who came to the United States and were told that they could not become citizens, and then states passed alien land laws in California and Washington and Oregon and other states saying that they could neither own nor lease land unless they could become a citizen. So since the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1790s actually said only whites could become citizens, and then it was amended after the Civil War to say that African Americans could become citizens, it meant that other people were excluded. And even though Asians might have identified themselves as white in terms of their phenotype, they were denied that category of being white in terms of law, which meant that they could neither lease nor own land, which meant they could not compete with white farm owners and other white landowners in those places. In the same way, African Americans were excluded from being able to get loans from mortgage companies in order to be able to buy land and buy property, when their white counterparts were able to do so under loans that were guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration from the 1930s all the way to the late 1960s. All of these created economic advantages in the market based on white identity, meaning that as a white person, you did not have to act in a way that had demonstrated racial animus toward any individual, and you would therefore benefit from what the structures of the society were providing to you that were like magic, right? It just seemed that you just worked hard and then bada boom, bada bing, these things were available to you, right? But the exclusion of unions from hiring African Americans and hiring Latinos and hiring Asians, and only hiring them when they did in janitorial positions and low-level positions, and never hiring them in management positions. All of those positioned white people who have a white identity to greater advantages and opportunities. The denial of admissions in the colleges and universities around the same racial categories, again, provided that same kind of phenomenon. So what does that mean? It created a racial dominance in a society by which your racial identity meant that you had a disproportionate share of education, disproportionate share of good housing, disproportionate share of employment, disproportionate share of political representation, disproportionate share of security, disproportionate share of good and quality food, disproportionate share of leisure, right? At the same time, people of color had a disproportionate share of incarceration, a disproportionate share of disease, a disproportionate share of poor education, disproportionate share of low quality food, low quality housing, and stigmatization and vilification, right? And these are dominant categories. These are categories by which your group membership associates you with a hierarchy in a society that says you deserve to be here before you do or say anything, and you deserve to be here before you do or say anything. And that kind of racial dominance, right, will remain in place as long as we engage in a free market approach to our society to say, oh no, everything that is economic is neutral, as long as nobody had any intended bad racial motive, therefore all is good. And it basically takes all of those historic practices that created unfair advantages and it just locks them in and pretends as though they never existed, pretends as though they were irrelevant. It's like playing Monopoly and letting one group of players go, pass go, get $200, buy property from the very beginning for 20 or 30 different terms, and then have another group of players that could not buy property, could not get $200, and then waiting 20 or 30 turns and allowing them also to get $200 and saying, hey, this is fair, right? It's Monopoly, it's all fair, we're all playing by the same rules now, right? So the idea of group-based dominance basically means we have to look at the structures, the ideas in the society, the institutional practices in the society that maintain not equity, but inequity, and maintain not justice, but injustice. And the idea that we only look at people as individuals and their bad intent as individuals as a way of measuring racial discrimination is a hierarchy enhancing idea. It's an idea that keeps the group-based dominance in place, right? And as long as people adhere to that idea, then people will not see the dominance that is there. And then all of the inequality seems natural, it seems legitimate, it seems acceptable. And myself and Dean Bowen will be proof that obviously there's no discrimination, there's no racism, it has nothing to do with anything in society today because we have succeeded. Well, contrary to Herschel Walker's acclamation, the fact that you have an exceptional individual, right, whereas the dominant normative masses of people don't have the same opportunities, doesn't prove the rule, it proves the exception, right? It proves the exception. And so I think that we have to not get confused with the fact that a few exceptional people can get past the hurdles and the obstacles and the inequalities and injustices as a way of saying there's an equal opportunity for everyone.
Thank you, Professor. I'm sure we all agree that it is important to not have that perpetrator perspective, like you say in your article, but to view racism through a systemic lens and not just an individual lens. So definitely want to thank you for that. And so this next question is, what systemic obstacles exist to achieving health equity as well as environmental justice? And for example, Title VI or the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. If you all could just talk about the systemic obstacles.
I'll start, but I just want to say mic drop for that last answer. I'm still standing here going, wow, I'm not sure we need to say anything else after that. Let me try. I want to say one thing before I answer the question. I love the exceptionalism point, right? You point to two of us and say, oh, the system must be working. I love what Professor Waterhouse said about the exception being the rule, proving the exception as opposed to the rule. But I also want to make clear, I think Professor Waterhouse would agree with me, we actually aren't that exceptional, right? There are plenty of Black people, plenty of brown people, plenty of immigrants who didn't have the opportunity, who were denied the opportunity structurally to stand where we stand today. And the fact that we're here really should be an embarrassment because we are here with so few other of our compatriots, right? So I want to be clear that there were people generations and generations before me that could have done what I'm doing today. And they were systemically prevented from doing so. So the exceptionalism is not that we're exceptional, it's that the rule, the system only allowed certain exceptions to get through. So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to talk about is the question that you asked, Ellis, about what are the structural barriers. I'm going to talk about just one because we are talking to law students, and I actually want to issue this as a challenge to you, law students. One of the structural barriers to realizing health equity is this perpetuation of an intent-based structure for anti-discrimination law. And I want to be clear, we got religion about wanting to see intent pretty late in the day, right? Because when we look back at those laws that segregated our society, they were intentional, right? They were intentional. We look at, I'm going to give you an example of Charlottesville. There was a 1910 segregation law. It is a wonder to behold, because it is 9 sections that say a Black person cannot buy a house next to a white person, and tells us the percentage of people that can live in the same square mile, the same building. And if you look at Jim Crow laws and wonder about what the intent was, you will see that there were intentional discrimination laws about every aspect of life. I mean, they intentionally discriminated against Blacks in favor of whites about where you could be buried after you're dead. After you're dead, you can't get in the cemetery with a white person, right? Intentional. But when it comes time to unravel those laws, when it comes time to reverse the effect of those laws, suddenly we want some colorblind, intent-based legal regimes that in fact are perpetuations of white supremacy, just as Professor Waterhouse has said. I would like to see our law students bring down this notion of Washington v. Davis's intent status, or intent standard, I should say, that has permeated anti-discrimination law in very many ways, has crippled it. That's one obstacle. A second one is Alexander v. Sandoval. And I'm doing just the legal obstacles right now because I want to challenge the students in our audience to look at the law critically. Alexander v. Sandoval is a structural obstacle because it eliminated the private cause of action under Title VI that could have been used by people like those pictured behind you, Ellis, to attack the racist and structurally discriminatory processes that place pollution sources disproportionately in Black and brown neighborhoods. But we have not got that private cause of action anymore because the Supreme Court has removed it in Alexander v. Sandoval. That's a structural deterrent that needs to be removed. I'm gonna go out on a limb a little bit. My poor GW law students, they thought they hired a nice quiet dean, and here I come now and I'm gonna talk about reparations, all right? So it's my opinion, and I will say this for my personal part. I'm not representing the school, the board of trustees, or anybody else who doesn't want to sign on. But it's my opinion that another structural barrier is the inequitable distribution of wealth and resources that must be legislatively corrected by a law that awards reparations to the descendants of those who worked for free and built this country by their free labor. I actually don't think that problem is that hard, to be honest with you. I think people have made it very difficult. But when you listen to Professor Waterhouse's beautiful explanation, right, of the monopoly game, I don't have enough lifetimes to wait to correct the number of rounds that were inequitably run in the monopoly game that is the American capitalist system, right? And if we want to see equity, we have to give reparations, not as a handout, and let me make that my last point, not as a handout, not as a favor. Let's be clear, this is not a favor. It's not charity to make sure that people who were victims are going to have an opportunity to catch up. No, I think we should see this as a moment in time where this country could actually purge itself of a moral travesty, right? The inequitably distributed resources are more than just in need of correction. We are living a lie fundamentally. To have created a country that is founded on the document that says we acknowledge that all men, didn't even say woman, but all men and women are created equal and endowed by their creator but with certain inalienable rights, right? To put emblazoned on the Supreme Court door right down the street that there is equal justice under the law, and to live under the lie that we are seeing exhibited and displayed and uncovered by COVID, it is a moral dissonance that we need to correct in order to become the country we say we want to be.
That was well said, Dean Matthew, well said. Professor Waterhouse?
Yes, so a couple of things. One, I dropped some 4 links in the chat to the studies I was citing earlier that kind of relate to how your race predicts your likely exposure rates to these pollutants and the consequences that can flow from them. Secondly, I want to mention that I wholeheartedly agree with the dean. When I talk about exceptionalism, I don't mean that we are necessarily exceptional. I mean, I know the dean actually is exceptional, but I know, I know that the reason that I am where I am is not because of my exceptional talent or capacity. There are many, many, many other people at all levels of my journey who worked harder, who were smarter, who were actually more talented. But as the dean has said, that just didn't have the opportunities to be able to do what I did. And so that to me is the exception. I'm the exception in that I was able to get past those blockades. And then the other piece I want to get to is to agree with the comment that the dean has raised about the idea that reparations is important. And I want to make a note about that in terms of reparations. And that is in many ways to say that, you know, I had a colleague at a conference one time I was presenting about reparations, and he stood up at the end. He was head of our African American Studies department where I was teaching. He stood up at the end. He said, I have a question about reparations. He said, isn't reparations something that one country paid to another country after the end of a war? And we were like, Yeah, that's kind of our earliest models, Germany and after the war, and providing reparations to Holocaust survivors and others, and even before that, Germany after World War I, and providing reparations to France and England after losing the war. And so he said, that's right, that's right. And he said, so I don't know, you're looking for reparations, but I don't know that the war is over, right? In other words, he's saying that the conflict that relates to racial identity and the commitment that racial identity is a legitimate basis upon which to distribute opportunities and resources and goods and benefits and harms in the society. I don't know that that war is over. And so he was saying that we're looking for reparations, but we're still every day taking casualties in that war. And so in some ways, there's a certain way that until America has adopted the idea of an anti-racist approach to dealing with the problems of race in a society, rather than a individualist, non-racist approach, as long as I don't have any racial animus against Latinx people, as long as I don't have any racial animus against indigenous people, as long as I don't have any racial animus against African Americans, then therefore everything is good, right? This whole idea of the racism without racist that Professor Benillia Silva talks about, you know, until we kind of have moved beyond that, then I think we have to understand that reparations and redress, while, you know, it's a passion of mine, I did my dissertation about it. It obviously is something we need and we should be pressing for, but there's a societal kind of unwillingness to concede the war. There's an ongoing struggle, an anti-Blackness struggle, anti-Hispanic, Latino struggle. There's an anti-Indigenous struggle, and there's still a foreignness and exclusion that applies to people who are Asian. That white identity is still dominant and normative in American society. And until we are willing to let go of that white privilege, until we're willing to let go of that centering white identity and see American identity as one that is not working class people and then people of color, right? The idea that somehow people of color are not working class people, they're not working people, hardworking Americans, right? There are all of these terms that we use to throw off the idea that we have urban and rural, which is supposed to be a code word, right? So we have all these ideas that are used to actually misrepresent the reality of American society, right? So we have to move, in many ways, white identity away from being a normative identity. And I know it's hard, because from the founding of the country, white identity was a normative identity, but it was not expressly stated as so. So a lot of people confuse the fact that it was implicit for being that it wasn't there, but it was implicit, but it was very present, right? So when the Constitution was written, when the preamble was written, African enslaved people were running errands and carrying out tasks for Thomas Jefferson. They were not on his mind when he was writing. And so until we are able to acknowledge, right, which is part of reparations, we can argue, right? Until we're able to acknowledge that history, how that history continues to impact our present and our own opportunities, until we're able to move there, we can't get to an effective resolution for all of these problems. So I want to say reparations, absolutely, yes, now. And part of reparations begins with a willingness to concede the war. That the war against people of color as not being tangential, not being marginal, not being a special interest, but being core and central along with white counterparts. Until we get there, we actually won't be able to bring the solutions we need to these problems.
Thank you, Professor Waterhouse, for that great explanation and for those thoughts. And so I see that we're running out of time. And so I'm going to give the panelists basically some time to just give the attendees something to take away, something that you like us to just leave this conversation with. And before I do that, I just would like to give a call of action on behalf of HEALS and on behalf of GWEELA. And this call of action is just to challenge the attendees, whether you be students, lawyers, what have you, to and just embrace the fight for environmental justice, and to learn what you can do as an individual or as a member of a community to help people of color and poor communities achieve environmental justice. And thank you. So, Dean Matthew, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to echo your call to action, Ellis. I feel as though you said it beautifully. The work that is to be done, we're depending on the young lawyers and lawyers to be to continue the fight against environmental justice, against structural racism, and against racism in capitalism as well. I guess I'll leave you with this thought. We have a lot of data that shows that racism kills Black and white people, right? I just want us to realize that the struggle we are undertaking is to save the soul of this whole country, right? It's not to do some kind of charity work, as I said earlier. Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote the 1619 Project, and I just cannot commend that to you enough, especially the parts of it that say that when this country created democracy, it took Black people to make us live up to it. Whatever our legal and moral aspirations are, it will take you lawyers and lawyers to be fighting for environmental justice to make this country live up to it. And we need you, both here in the audience, but also out in the courts, in the halls of legislators, in the streets, making sure that we live up to our aspirations.
Professor Waterhouse.
So I'll just say the dean has said it so eloquently, and I already took too long solo like Charlie Parker. I'm going to basically just end with saying that I want to echo the dean's comments about you all as law students. Don't see the law as locked into what it is today. It's no more locked into what it is today than it was locked in when the civil rights cases came out or when Plessy versus Ferguson came out. There is room for change, and lawyers have to fight to bring about those changes, and they have to do that fight in conjunction with people involved in social movements. So the civil rights movement was a watershed movement. The women's rights movement was a watershed movement. The LGBTQ rights movement was a watershed movement. We have to engage in watershed movements to get the awareness of the country to a place where judges and legislators are willing to change the law to produce equity and justice. And so I want to encourage you all to follow up on the dean's comments about Alexander v. Sandoval and Washington v. Davis, and let me know any insights that you have about how we can get those decisions overturned by the court or by the legislature. Either one would work for me. So with that said, thanks so much for the invitation. Thank you so much, Dean, for this opportunity.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be with you again. Carlton, I love working with you. Thank you, everyone, for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dane. And attendees, I would love to just remind you all that we have breakout sessions occurring now, so just stay tuned for that. Thank you.
So do we stay in this, or do we follow the link to go to the breakout?
The link that Austin dropped in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to end this meeting and stop the recording so that we can open up the breakout rooms. Thank you again, Dean Matthew and Dr. Waterhouse. Talk to you soon.
Bye.